I'm Jeff Helfrich, State Representative for House District 52. Life's messy, government's messier. When I was on the street, I got to see what worked and what didn't work. And in Salem, I see a lot of things that aren't working. I want to cut through that red tape, get to simpler government, and get to stuff that works for you. Here's our next episode. That's perfect, right? Today, it's Behind the Gavel with Kevin Mannix from House District 21. Kevin, you're a lawyer, crime fighter, a guy who's seen it all from South America to Salem. You've got quite the journey that you've encompassed in your life. And so let's dive into this right now. You grew up in Ecuador and Panama and kind of down in South America, and eventually, I think your dad was in the Foreign Service, and then you ended up in Virginia. Let's kind of unpack that a little bit. Tell me what you came out of that.
Well, I turned 5 on a ship bound from the United States to Ecuador. My dad had just joined the Foreign Service, and his first station was Quito, Ecuador. So we spent 4 years in Ecuador, and I went to school there. I learned Spanish while I was there, and then we were shipped from Ecuador to Panama, the country of Panama, not the Panama Canal Zone, where my dad's job, in all of the places he was located, it was his job to help local businesses understand how they can export their products to the United States, how they can build up their small businesses. So that was his job. And so we lived in Panama City, although I went to school in the Canal Zone at Ancon Elementary School. Those were the days when the U.S. still ran the Canal Zone. But we were not Zonians. We lived in Panama City, and I learned to get more used to another form of Spanish, which I'll call Caribbean Spanish, faster and more of a lilt to it. Then we went back to the States, and I was in Virginia for 2 years, in Arlington, Virginia, while my dad was stationed in D.C., and I went to St. Thomas, a Catholic school, parish school, for 6th and 7th grades. Then we turned around and were sent again to Bolivia. So I spent about a year and a half in La Paz, Bolivia, up at about 13,000 feet, which was, you acclimate real quickly to being at a high altitude. When we came back, I was in the 9th grade into Virginia, and that's where I went to high school, and then it seemed natural to go to college at the University of Virginia, and it seemed even more natural to go to law school at the University of Virginia. But it was in college where I met my wife.
Yep. And
Susanna was also a Foreign Service kid, and she had last been stationed in the Dominican Republic. And she graduated high school in the Dominican Republic, but her folks had a house in Falls Church, Virginia. So she went to the University of Virginia, and I met her when she was a first-year student. I was already a fourth-year student. And a couple years later, we started dating while I was in law school and she was in nursing school. But the twist is, we were both Foreign Service kids. I thought, well, we're in Virginia, right? Getting my law degree. She's getting her nursing degree. And she said, so? And we agreed to study up and adopt a home state.
Yeah.
And what we did was, back then it was not internet stuff. It was you go to almanacs.
You had to go look at a book, right?
Yeah.
And you pull out the encyclopedia.
And we got down to Washington and Oregon. We really liked both those states. But Governor Tom McCall kept saying, well, please visit, but don't stay. And I thought, well, that's way cool.
Yeah.
So I came out to Oregon to interview. And I still remember I came out and interviewed with some law firms in Portland. But then one afternoon, it was a Tuesday afternoon, I had this rented Volkswagen. I drove out to Cannon Beach and spent some time there. I had a beer and a burger watching the sunset. And I still remember driving back in my rental car to Portland. I pulled into what they had in those days was a phone booth.
Yep.
And I called Suzanne. I said, I think I know where we want to be. And so everything else focused on Oregon. And when we both graduated, we actually honeymooned through Mexico City and San Francisco on our way to Oregon, and where we've settled ever since.
That's a tremendous story. So that's going to lead into my next question I've got for you. So all your global trotting around the world as a young adult, and then you came back to the States and came back and forth. What's one lesson that when you went around traveling around that you remember and that you brought back to Oregon with you?
I think it's a sensitivity to other cultures and the values of those cultures, because I went to Catholic school and learned Spanish in Catholic school in Quito, Ecuador. Aprendí español cuando jovencito. I learned Spanish when I was a little kid. And but when we went to Panama, there I am going to a school in the Canal Zone while living in Panama, seeing the Panamanian culture, and then the Canal Zone culture was its own. It had been established when we built the canal, and it was all Canal Zone people and military. There was another, they had their own culture, and we did refer to them as the Zonians, interesting term. But then when we came back to Virginia, there was something else that I saw. I'd been sort of innocent about what was going on with integration in the United States, but I came back to Arlington, Virginia in ninth grade, and it turned out, I didn't realize it at the time, I was going to an all-white junior high school for ninth grade. And the Arlington County, Virginia schools were finally integrating, and my first year in high school was the first year of integration in the high school. And what I noticed was the parents, many of the parents turned their backs on the school. They closed down the Parent-Teachers Association and all that. But we kids, many of us were foreign service kids, and we all got together and we weren't going to buy into that. And it was a completely successful integration of Wakefield High School. The black high school in Arlington was closed. Most of their students went to our high school, and it was a working class area of the county, yet the kids all got together. Race was not an issue with our integration. It was with some of those old line adults, but we reestablished all the traditions and programs that they had been setting aside as integration proceeded, and I was heavily involved in that as a student council member and all of that. And I don't talk a lot about it because we're reflecting on the past. Yeah. But I remember the first time I realized what was going on, and I'll stop after this because there's a lot that I can talk about. I was on the bus going home from school, and I heard this kid talking about he was going to go to this all-white private academy so that he wouldn't have to go to school with, and he used a pejorative term about black people. Uh-huh. And I had not really dealt with that during my life, and I had to understand there were people that thought that way, which really threw me off.
Yeah. So kind of fast forward, you graduated, I think the research I did in 1974, became a law clerk. And then eventually you became Attorney General in Oregon and in Guam.
Well, an Assistant Attorney General. Trial Division, the Appellate Division. Then I went to Guam.
Yeah, you were Assistant Attorney General, and then in Oregon, and then Guam, and then you started your own law practice in '86, right?
'86. Well, the Guam thing was actually another adventure, and there's a longer story here. But Suzanne and I kept our house, and I was hired to be an Assistant Attorney General for the U.S. Territory, and we went out together. This was BC, Before Children. Mm-hmm. And so I was an Assistant Attorney General. You have to do a lot more stuff
these BC times. So same with us. I mean, I'm a little older dad. I got 11 and 13-year-old at home now, but yeah, I know what you mean.
And it makes a difference. So we felt free to go out there for a couple of years, and Susanna became a civilian nurse for the U.S. Navy at the Naval Regional Medical Center for 2 years. And then we came back to Oregon. And actually, I was an administrative law judge for the state for 3 years. Then I went into private practice. And after 3 years working with a Portland firm, commuting out of Salem, I formed my own law firm in January of '86, which I still have.
Yeah. So out of all that experience in the legal grind, if you will, because that was probably a pretty good grind in going through all that, how did that shape you and your first run in the legislature in '88? How did that shape you and your thoughts?
I think the most important thing was a realization that government can serve the people. As an Assistant Attorney General, as an administrative law judge, even earlier as a law clerk, I was working for the government, but I considered myself working for the people. It helps put you into that mindset. And then when I went into private practice, I recognized there you're advocating for private sector clients. But when you're running for office again, then you're returning to that public sphere where you have a chance to advocate for things that you believe are good for the people. And it gave me a sense of perspective as to the role of government, understanding the possibilities of government, but also the limitations of government. It is not the be-all and end-all in our lives, and we need to remember that.
Yeah, back to the basics, right? Limited government, which we all talk about. So I think it was, is it 90? Yeah, it was 19. I'll lead into the question. So generally on the House floor, I'll joke with some of my colleagues. They'll have to take a tough vote. We'll do these bill polls, and somebody wants to vote a certain way, and then they have to change their vote and stuff like that. But I think it was in '97. You switched from a Democrat to Republican, and I will always take their voter registration card. Hey, so and so, just sign right here. I'll get it turned in for you. You can become a Republican right now, and we'll get you an office on the third floor. So, talk about your experience because you flipped.
I started out as a conservative Democrat. I was elected in 1988, representing Salem, and I was recruited by Vera Katz, who was the House Speaker at the time. And the deal I made with her was, look, procedurally, I'll work with the Democratic caucus. That's important. But as to substantive matters, it's my conscience and my constituents. And she always honored that. And when I was serving for 8 years, 4 terms as a Democrat, my colleagues in the House honored that. But the Democratic Party, in my view, moved away from that. Being a conservative Democrat, I saw more and more some distancing. And in terms of my moderate position on fiscal matters and the fact that I'm pro-life, I saw more and more pressure against me within the party. And I thought, my pro-life position is a matter of my moral perspective, and I'm not changing that. And philosophically, being moderate about financial matters, I'm not really changing that. And Greg Walden, who was a state representative at the time.
My former state representative, he lives down the street from me, yep.
Republican leader. And several times I still remember he'd come down to my seat on the floor, and he'd pat me on the back and point at the board and say, see, Kevin, you're voting with us. You ought to be with us.
That's a great story.
And so in January of 97, I left the legislature, and that same week I became a Republican. The very next year, the Republicans appointed me to a short-term vacancy in the Senate while I was running to go back to the House as a Republican. And in 98, I was elected to represent the Salem area as a Republican in the House. But I served there until from January 99 to January 2001, but then I ran for governor.
Yeah.
And I was the Republican nominee for governor in 2002. The lesson I learned is whatever label they put on us, it's very hard up in the Portland community. When I ran for governor in 2002, if Multnomah County didn't exist, I won by 55,000 votes. Yeah. I lost Multnomah County by 88,000 votes. Yeah, wow. There's a lesson there.
No, there is lessons there. I'm going to make sure I get the history right, but from the research that I did, you have passed 135 bills, the most in Oregon history, author of Measure 11. What's one of the, you fought for victims' rights, sentencing, enhanced sentencing guidelines. What's one fight in Salem that you cut through the chaos, that you won, that you're so proud of?
Well, if it's recent,
your whole career, your whole career, right?
Well, I think that it was passing a number of bills that improved the public safety system. It wasn't a single bill, but I got to the point where I was getting a lot of bills through, talking to my colleagues, paying attention to the details of the public safety system and things that had been ignored, where you could smooth something out, make it work better, and support law enforcement, but also support justice. And I think Measure 11 is sort of the epitome of that, because I was getting all kinds of things done. But in 1989, we had done what we called sentencing guidelines, which made it harder for judges to impose the top sentences, and there were guideline sentences. And I supported it at the time. The promise was, well, these are driven by limited resources, and as we establish more resources, we'll make them better guideline sentences. Well, I came back this was 89. I came back in 91. I got more bills through than anybody else. 93, I got more bills through than anybody else. And I couldn't get them to even hold a hearing adding a minute to the guideline sentences. Then I realized this ballpark is being constricted and it's not going to open up. So I went to the public with Measure 11.
Mm-hmm. I remember that as a police officer. We were cheering you on. That was awesome.
Mandatory minimum prison sentences for violent crimes. And we established that by looking at what are the typical sentences around the country. I didn't write it on the back of an envelope. I talked to prosecutors. And these are supposed to be the mandatory minimum sentences.
Right.
And they are. But because the guidelines have never been modernized, they are the actual sentences that people get. The good part is there's no ifs, ands, or buts. No early release, no parole, no good time. You will serve this minimum. But my example is first-degree rape. Typically around the country, you get 12 to 15 years for that. The mandatory minimum is 100 months, which is 8 years and 4 months. Well, that's the sentence that's being imposed because the guideline sentence, when we were fighting this, is 22 months.
Yeah.
First-degree rapists getting 22 months. It just blew my mind.
Not acceptable. You and I we had a hiatus from our tenures in the House and then you in the Senate, and you and I came back in 23, and then right now, what do you think is one of the fixes you're trying to chase now in your second term back in the House? What's one of the simplest fixes you're trying to get done?
I think we need to be addressing and it's not, I'm not even on the committees dealing with it, but all of a sudden this attitude of some of our urban legislators that somehow they could run the lives of our farmers. We've spoken out against that recently. Overall, the big issue that my constituency and I see is housing and then homelessness. And there's an overlap, but they're separate. The folks are unable to find affordable housing. I mean, working people who can't pay good rent and have a good place where they want to buy a house and they just don't have the capability because we don't have enough houses being built. We don't have enough land being dedicated to housing. So that is a big cosmic problem here in Oregon that we need to address, and we're working on it, believe me. The homelessness is more of a mental health and drug addiction issue combined with some folks who actually have got jobs who can't find a place to stay. Yeah. But we sometimes treat that as though it's part of the housing issue. Well, there's an overlap, but housing itself is a big deal. I still remember recently I was at a gas station, and this is before it was actually about 2 years ago now. A woman pumped gas at the gas station, and she recognized me, and she said, Representative Mannix, I want you to know something. I'm living with my mom. She's on Social Security, and I'm working 40 hours a week. We can't find a place to rent in Salem. We're living in my mom's van. That, to me, was the epitome of what's wrong with what we're doing right now. Why aren't we producing the housing so people can find a place to stay? And that's working people, much less the issues that we have with the mess in our streets, the degradation of our neighborhoods by folks who leave messes and camp out where they're not supposed to. And some of them have mental health issues. Some of them have drug addiction issues. We need to be intervening and dealing with that.
Yeah. All right. This is part of the segment. Let's go behind the gavel. Give me one story in your life, whether it was in your travels through South America, law, your other legislative things, but early on in time in Salem that hit you hard, that made you pause, and then that helped develop you as a leader. Because we're all leaders in certain ways, but you definitely have led on a lot of different things. And give me one little snippet of your life that you think it's a story. It's like, wow, I didn't see that one.
Well, actually, it was fairly recently in 2023. During the time I was outside of the legislature, I still had my law firm. I was chair of the Republican Party and chair of the Marion County Republicans, things like that, helping our people in public office, but not being in office myself. I was constantly trying to get the legislature to address the death tax, the estate tax. And in the 2023 session, we were able to get a $15 million exemption from the death tax for family-owned farms and timberlands and ranches, family-owned. And that gives them a lease on life to keep these in the family. Well, I don't have any ranches or farms or timberlands in my district. It's urban, suburban. But what I saw was if you can be advocating for a cause that means something to other people, and then you reach out. I reached out to urban Democrats and said, who are the best stewards of the environment out there, out on those farms and ranches? The family-owned folks, the families that are running them. Right. And this is an environmentally positive thing to do, to let them keep those farms and ranches in the family. And enough Democrats agreed with that. And the Republicans, we all hate the death tax. I hate it because I think you've already paid taxes all your life. Why tax your estate when you die? In any event, we got enough support in the House and Senate, and the governor signed it. And I felt that was a real accomplishment. And I still want to do more to reform that tax, but it has a real impact on our working people and what they can do to pass what they've worked so hard to pass it on to their family rather than have the tax person take it away.
Yeah, that's hitting us hard, hit a lot of people hard. So let's kind of jump to vision for Oregon. You know, government can overcomplicate things, and we got to simplify stuff. What's one takeaway, one vision that we can actually keep things simple for people and get back to the basics?
I think we need to keep the justice system simple. We've made it way too complicated on two sides. One is with the ordinary folk, real people out there who want to go to court to get something resolved, the small claims court and all of that. We need to make access to the courts simpler. And I was the author of the Magistrates Division law for the tax court. So when you have a tax beef, you don't have to hire a lawyer. You can go into the Magistrates Division and represent yourself. And they keep the rules simple. The magistrate sits down with you and whoever represents the government to go through the issue. And majority of the cases resolved in tax court now are resolved in the Magistrates Division. Now, people can still get an attorney, but often they don't need to. And that's a simple process. I like that kind of approach. Well, we've made most of the justice system, both in criminal law and civil law, very complicated. And some of it's necessary to protect due process, but some of it, I think, just is designed to put tripwires in the system so we can't do justice.
Right.
And I think that's a mistake.
Is there anything, that type of perspective and simplifying government and getting back to the basics, just you'd want to do for your district? Because we can talk about statewide issues, but there's a lot of times that we got elected to represent our districts. And so for District 21, is there anything specific you think you can try to work on?
Well, my reality check is we have the largest percentage of publicly owned property in our city and county right here in Salem. And compared to the state, I should say. And the state doesn't pay any property taxes, but the state sure needs a lot of services: police, fire, ambulance, emergency responders, community cleanup, whatever, in terms of those state properties. And I would like to see the state help the city of Salem, and actually Keizer too, deal with the impact of all these state institutions and the fact that the state's not paying property taxes, which is how we pay for local government. So right now, that is an issue that I'm pursuing to try to help, especially Salem, but also Keizer.
Yeah, those are all great things we got to work on. So kind of wrapping this up, what is one thing you've heard me say it numerous times throughout, the last couple of years, but getting back to basics, what's one nugget that you could leave our listeners with to say, yes, this is what I want to try to get us back to basics with?
I think we want to get back to basics as to our schools. The state is micromanaging our school districts. We give them more money, and then we tie the money to all kinds of directives about how they should spend it. I would like the schools to have much more local authority to decide their curriculum, to work with the parents, give parents much more power dealing with their school districts, and have the state step back from the micromanagement of our schools.
Kevin, that's good stuff right there. And with that, Kevin, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Folks, you get to listen to a legend. I look at him at the house floor and he can come up with stuff on the fly like that and start talking, and he just keeps going and it just flows out, and it's awesome to hear. So till next time, let's get back to basics. Stay strong. Back to Basics Army. Till next time, we're out.